Mon Dieu, que ton esprit nous accompagne et nous guide dans notre travail pour le bien de tous.
Guide us as work for peace and justice in our land and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of all those we serve. Amen.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Minister statements. Minister Akwetla Godani, the Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Mr. Speaker, the transformational changes we have been making across the education system are gaining momentum to help fulfill this government's mandate commitments towards education renewal. Under the Skills for Success strategy, grades 9 to 12 students and youth aged 18 to 24 across the North will soon have access to career and education advisors. The Department of Education, Culture and Employment has already hired 6 to work with students to help them navigate their best academic path from classroom to career. The career and education advisors have been hired for an initial 2-year terms based in Yellowknife, but each one is responsible for a specific region. This will enable the team to research and develop a consistent approach for delivering the educational advisory services to students and youth across the Northwest Territories. They will work as a mobile team to provide services both in person and by distance. School pilots are planned for the 2018-2019 winter semester to pilot the new resources and approach in selected schools throughout the regions. The permanent locations of the positions will be determined once the results of the pilots are available and informed decisions can be made as to where the positions would best be placed. Work is being planned in consultation with education bodies and regional ECE service center staff to build upon and strengthen existing resources. The advisors will work as a mobile team to provide advice to students and youth so that they can make informed decisions to improve their education and employment outcomes. They will also support youth aged 18 to 24 to become re-engaged in learning, promote skilled trades as careers, and assist students with finding financial supports for in-demand occupations. Mr. Speaker, the department has also been working to solidify all of the components of the High School Pathways Initiative. This work includes new high school completion options, new courses, counseling supports, and technologies to better support students and offer them new opportunities. I'm pleased that the courses on life skills are now being added, so students have an understanding of finances, budgeting, self-awareness, and decision-making, as well as preparing them for future education or training and giving them effective tools to manage their lives. Focus groups with students and teachers, as well as community town halls, will take place in the spring of 2019 to engage parents, students, and communities. The new high school pathways model will roll out across the Northwest Territories one grade at a time, starting with grade 7 students in September 2019 to 2020. As a part of the High School Pathways Initiative and as a further contribution to indigenizing education, ECE will begin the development of a new Northern Studies 20 course that will be required for graduation. Northern Studies 20 will be focused on opportunities for students to learn about land claims, treaties, and implementation agreements, as well as more in-depth learning about the Northwest Territories style of consensus government. Northern Studies 20 is expected to be fully implemented in 2023 to 2024, with the first cohort of grade 11 students following the new high school pathways model. Mr. Speaker, another objective of education renewal is to assist students to be able to access the courses necessary so they can attend any post-secondary school they choose. A critical initiative we have in place and that has proven to be successful is Northern Distance Learning. Northern Distance Learning allows students to remain in their community and take higher-level academic courses via a video conferencing network out of N.W.T. Education, Culture and Employment worked with education bodies to identify the next 4 small communities to offer Northern Distance Learning in 2019 to 2020. And they are Fort Providence, Lutz-Kay, Paulatuk, and N.W.T. There will be a total of 15 schools accessing this service in 2019 to 2020. The program will be expanded further in 2020 to 2021 for a total of 20 schools that will offer a comprehensive education in students' home communities. Students will experience high-quality and uninterrupted internet service through dedicated bandwidth purchased specifically for the delivery of this initiative. It is important that every student have an opportunity for quality education, and we are proud that we are now able to offer this opportunity to students in small and remote communities. Mr. Speaker, no single group or organization can accomplish change alone. Our partnerships with our school bodies, the N.W.T. Association of Teachers, parents, and community members are critical to our success. Positive, healthy experiences for children of all ages are a shared responsibility that includes business and community partners, health services, government, and families working together towards a common goal, the healthy development of the children of the Northwest Territories. Masay Cho, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister statements. Minister statements. Colleagues, I'd like to draw your attention to the visitors in the gallery today. Here with us, Mr. Anthony W.J. Whitford. As many of you know, Mr. Whitford held many roles. Former commissioner, former speaker, former minister, former member, former sergeant at arms, honorary clerk at the table, and member of Order of N.W.T. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Whitford to the House this afternoon. It's always a pleasure to have you in our chamber. Member statements. Member for Trinidad Willowday.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last week the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, CRTC, which is a federal regulatory body that oversees all Canadian broadcasting and telecom activities, released a report on aggressive and misleading series of sales practices within the telecommunications industry. Mr. Speaker, this report has long been awaited because many Canadians, including many Northerners, have long suspected the existence of such sale practices. So after months of research and cross-country consultations, the CRTC has concluded that there is indeed a high prevalence of aggressive and misleading sales practices within the telecom and television marketplace. Such sale practices are found to exist in all manners of sale, including in-store and over the phone, door-to-door, and online. Mr. Speaker, some examples of these negative sales practices includes sale agents not accepting no as an answer, or service providers making it difficult to change or cancel services, or sale agents withhold key contractual terms or provide inaccurate consumer information. Of course, some service providers engage in such practices more than others. However, these practices are occurring to such an extent that it's resulting in harm being done to consumers. Mr. Speaker, these situations have a potential to inflict both mental stress and financial hardships with consumers. Moreover, the effects of such harms are amplified when it comes to vulnerable populations such as seniors, persons with disabilities, and people with language barriers. Other vulnerable factors include low levels of digital literacy skills, as well as lower education and income levels. In terms of solutions, Mr. Speaker, while the report did indicate that service providers do have internal measures to monitor such sales practices, they vary from one provider to another. But overall, existing internal measures are insufficient. The report also noted that based on evidence gathered, many people are unaware of what options exist to seek redress in this area. For instance, the report discovered that many Canadians don't know that there's an independent body dedicated to resolving telecom consumer complaints, which is called the Commission of Complaints for Telecom Television Services. Mr. Speaker, while this report does fall under the federal jurisdiction, my goal with this statement is to help raise awareness around this issue with people of the N.W.T, because clearly more work needs to be done in addressing negative sales practices within the telecom industry across this country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ikagodan and the member Cam Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I rise today to speak on the importance of learning new languages and how language learning connects us to our culture and heritage and is kept alive by the hard work of dedicated community members who promote and preserve language learning in our communities. Although there are many different organizations devoted to language promotion in the Northwest Territories, I want to take the time today to recognize the N.W.T branch for Canadian Parents for French and the many volunteers who support the organization. I first learned about Canadian Parents for French, or CPF, when I was looking for extracurricular activities in French for my son, who I'm proud to say is enrolled in a French immersion program and is well on his way to fluency in both English and French. I was so impressed with the quality of the CPF programs that I immediately joined the organization and continue to support their important work in the N.W.T. Canadian Parents for French se devenaient à la promotion et à la création d'occasions
dedicated for the promotion of learning of French as a second language for young Canadians. In 1977, Kay Spicer was the official language commissioner for Canada. He was interested by the bilingualism of young Canadians. He met parents across the country who wanted that their children could learn the second language. This small group, you started with parents, became a national network made up of 10 chapters and 150 sections all over the country. Over the past 4 years, local chapters in Northwest Ireland have regularly consulted with groups and native governments for developed strategies and to ensure the preservation and the teaching of other official languages. Mr. Speaker, the ability to speak several languages or any language give young people a competitive advantage to help them find work, to find new friends, and to come from different cultures. This ability to speak several languages gives a different perspective on the world, how an individual understands definitions and complex situations. That's to say, the ability to think, to express yourself, and to feel the feelings of other individuals gives unlimited vision.
Part of shaping individual and community identity. With 11 official languages, each one unique and priceless in its value to our northern heritage, keeping language learning strong is so important in achieving that goal. It is thanks to organizations like Canadian Parents for French that we can ensure future generations will continue to reap the benefits of speaking more than one language. I want to express my personal gratitude for this wonderful organization and the volunteers that work hard to make it a continued success. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ikagodan and the member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs for developing the Youth Ambassadors Program and giving Northern youth an amazing opportunity to volunteer and experience events across Canada, even internationally. I've had the opportunity to witness firsthand what they experience at these events. I'd like to thank the staff who We spent the past year getting our youth ready for the 2019 Canada Winter Games experience in Red Deer. Mr. Speaker, I could spend hours talking about this great program, but I think it's best to use words from our youth from Sumbakay, Fort Liard, and Fort Simpson. The trip to Red Deer was very tiring, but very worth it. It's so nice here. I spent a 2-hour shift, then traded some pins, and I've learned how to use the transit system. I met a few people from different provinces, and I'm looking forward to next week. Aaron. I'm excited and proud to be part of the N.W.T. Youth Ambassadors Program again, and to be in Red Deer, Alberta, volunteering at the Canada Winter Games. The journey here was quite tiring, but it was really worth it. So far, my shifts have been at the Red Deer Curling Centre. I've met a lot of people from all over Canada. I advise the youth in N.W.T. to sign up for this program next time because they're missing out on an awesome experience if they don't. AJ. I'm excited to be part of the N.W.T. Youth Ambassador Program for the Canada Winter Games. The trip was exhausting, but was worth it. Today, I started my shift at 7 a.m. for volunteer services. The job is excellent. There's a lot of friendly people that I've met, and I checked in and out. Given this opportunity to gain new experience and seeing people all around is amazing. Pin trading is slowly starting to take over me, but I hope everybody here has an amazing time as I am. Angel Rose. I've been really interested working and taking in entertainment while being in places that I haven't been before. 2 days ago, I was able to go to a concert. It was lots of fun. It was a blast, and that will probably be my best night in Red Deer. Zeta. In closing, I'd like to thank the youth for their hard work and the department for their commitment to our youth, and wish everybody all the best. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Member statement. Member Ika Godan and then Member Nanakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, World Water Day, led by United Nations, will take place on March 22nd. For the past 26 years, United Nations has partnered with countries and communities around the world to raise public awareness of the importance of fresh water and sustainable management of water resources. This year, World Water Day will focus on the theme, Leaving No One Behind. That means advocating and taking action for access to water, protecting and managing water resources, and educating ourselves on issues of water access, pollution, treatment, and sustainability. Here in the Northwest Territories, the federal and territorial governments are working with local leaders and educators in Tuktoyaktuk, as well as the Inuvik Water Board, to celebrate World Water Day in that community. If you're on Tuk on March 22nd, there will be World Water Day events at Kitty Hall from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m., including information booths, activities, challenges, displays on water and waste, and even door prizes. Mr. Speaker, there will also be opportunities to learn about water treatment with a presentation from the Department of Environment and Natural Resources and options for a tour of the community's water treatment plant. Tuktoyaktuk youth are also getting involved. Students from Mangalawick School worked hard on submissions to a poster contest and an emoji contest, both around the theme of raising awareness around water needs and water pollution. I'd like to congratulate the students from Mangalawick School on the winners: Emily Panaktaluk Ratty, Corabella Chixie, Zoe Warren, Miley Wilkie, Tamika Pokiak, and Kaden Cockney. Mr. Speaker, if you make it out to World Water Day in Tuk, be sure to look out for their art and display. Mr. Speaker, I definitely encourage people in the region to attend and learn more about water management in the Inuvik settlement region. Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Member statement. Member Ika Godan and then Member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was recently concerned to learn that the measles virus has spread to the N.W.T, and more specifically to my region in the Beaufort Delta. This concerns me because measles is a very serious and contagious disease caused by a virus. It can spread quickly through the air from an infected person when they cough or sneeze. Measles causes a red blotchy rash, high fever, runny nose, cough, red eyes. Most people recover fully from measles within 2 to 3 weeks. But measles can be dangerous, especially for infants, pregnant women, and those with weakened immune systems. Complications from measles disease can include ear infection, pneumonia, encephalitis or swelling of the brain, which can cause seizures, brain damage, or death. Mr. Speaker, immunization is the best way to protect against getting measles. Measles containing vaccines are safe and extremely effective. Higher risk individuals exposed to measles should immediately contact their community health center or healthcare practitioner. 2 doses of the vaccine are almost 100% protective. Because of immunizations, measles is now a very rare disease in Canada, but outbreaks still occur. Most cases occur in people born in 1970 or earlier, or later, who have not received 2 doses of measles vaccine and were in the same room as someone with measles. Most at risk are Canadians who travel overseas or areas with lower immunization rates or to areas with outbreaks. I'm very concerned and I want to ensure my constituents, especially children and parents, have access to the important health information and vaccines that can protect us from this disease. And I'll have questions for the Minister of Health and Social Services later today. Thank you.
Masi. Member statement. Member Ika Goodani and the member Techo.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm excited to report that today is the first day of the 37th annual Kamba Carnival. That's right. Since before some of my honorable colleagues were born, a team of dedicated volunteers from the Untitled First Nation, led by super volunteer Diane Fabian, have organized a winter festival that's been going strong since 1982. This winter gathering commonly sees visitors from northern Alberta and British Columbia and from all over the Northwest Territories. Many also come home especially for the carnival. The carnival takes place in the first weekend of March. This year, activities start today, February 28th, and run through to March the 3rd. I've taken a look at the agenda and it's jam-packed with activities. The carnival started with a fire feeding ceremony today at lunchtime, and over the rest of the day we'll see some long-time favorite events, including the crowning of the Carnival Queen. We'll also get to meet the carnival's brand new mascot, designed by 2 Hay River artisans, Kim Lee and Trisha Lawa, who will be revealed during the festivities. On Friday, there will be an outdoor youth games, a $10,000 bingo, and a drum dance. And on Saturday, things will get going with hand games, dog races, adult outdoor games, and talent show, and a country and western dance featuring Shane Daniels and the usual suspects. And if you thought things would slow down by the weekend, Mr. Speaker, you thought wrong. We'll see a pancake breakfast, more hand games, dog races, and outdoor games, as well as a polka derby, the award ceremonies, and raffle draws, and a drum dance. After that, I hope the hard-working volunteers will be able to take a well-deserved break. Mr. Speaker, I hope you and my colleagues will join me in congratulating the Kamba Carnival Organizing Committee for their incredible contribution to their community. They were recognized with an Outstanding Volunteer Award in 2016, and they're as worthy today as they were then. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Member statement. Member Ika Goodani and the member YELLOWKNIFE Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the government is considering amending its Employment Standards Act. A survey on the proposed changes closed about a month ago. The Department of Education, Culture and Employment is promising a report on what they heard soon, and I'm looking forward to hearing that the changes to the Act will include leave for workers who have experienced domestic violence. Mr. Speaker, domestic violence leave is a period of approved absence from work. Employers covered by the Employment Standards Act would make the time available to employees. Employees could use the time to seek medical attention, attend counseling appointments, get legal advice, or find a place to live. The benefit to the employee is that they don't have to worry about job security while they are coping with domestic violence. The advantage to employers is that they are able to retain workers who might otherwise quit. Domestic violence leave is now available in 5 provinces. The offering varies from 5 days of paid leave in Manitoba to 10 days of unpaid leave in Alberta. The federal government is also looking at introducing a combination of 5 days paid and 5 days unpaid leave for federally regulated industries, extending this benefit to almost 1 million workers. If the N.W.T. follows suit, there are several best practices to consider. The first is that there should be few barriers to accessing this leave. The second is that at least 5 days of leave should be paid. We know that many people struggle with the cost of living in the North, and they may be reluctant to take time off if the leave is unpaid. The next best practice is that discretion to grant leave should be up to employers rather than some outside authority. They would decide how to verify the need and what, if any, written justification they require. Of course, keeping all the information the employee shares confidential is of primary importance. And lastly, the allocation of the time should be flexible so that employees can take the leave intermittently or in a block, depending on what they need. Mr. Speaker, we are all aware of the epic rates of family violence we experience in the Northwest Territories and of the difficulty of attracting and keeping staff. Domestic violence leave would address both of those issues, and I look forward to seeing it included in the forthcoming amendments to the Employment Standards Act. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Gooden and the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. The Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment has issued 10 significant discovery licenses for oil and gas since devolution. The area covered by these licenses is almost 2,200 square kilometers, an area about 39% the size of Prince Edward Island. Our government will get no revenues, generate no taxes, and ensure no employment and no benefits from these areas that are now tied up virtually forever. Significant discovery licenses arose in the federal legislation that we inherited for petroleum resources. They allow companies to have exclusive ownership of oil and gas rights without having to do any work or pay any fees forever. Companies can even get these licenses without doing anything except being near another significant discovery license. A minister could require drilling to take place, but this has never been done. Such licenses amount to a resource giveaway that does nothing for our economy or for future generations. Unfortunately, this has happened under our watch after devolution. The minister had and still has options to change this bad move. This should have been fixed right after devolution rather than waiting for 5 years. There was no reason to wait this long, and other options may have been open to the minister. Some of the ways to deal with this problem include fixed terms for significant discovery licenses, limiting their size, setting work requirements or fee payments, or even eliminating such authorizations so an operator would move directly to a production license. Solutions are the subject of a bill before this House, and I will not discuss this any further. Needless to say, I'll have questions for the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment over the post-devolution issuance of 10 significant discovery licenses, how this happened, and what options may be open to generate benefits and revenues. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Gooden and the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's going to be a very scary weekend in Yellowknife. People from all around the circumpolar world are going to invade the capital, making our townsfolk quake in their boots and hide their eyes. No, Mr. Speaker, it's not the zombie apocalypse and it's not mosquito season. No, tonight it's the kickoff to the Dead North Film Festival. This festival is entering its 8th year, showcasing independent short horror films produced around the North. Dead North is, as they call it, the twisted brainchild of the 2 Yellowknife filmmakers Jay Balcart and Pablo Saravanja of Artless Collective, a Yellowknife North media production company, by the way. Since 2012, over 130 short films have been produced for Dead North by filmmakers from the N.W.T, Yukon, Nunavut, and as far away as Iceland. After Dead North, many of those films have traveled even further to festivals around the world, including Fantasia, Imaginative, New York City Horror Film Festival, and the famous Cannes Film Festival. This year's Dead North Film Festival will screen a record number of films. As well as screenings, the film the festival has visiting guests and offers workshops that provide mentorship to young northern filmmakers just learning their craft. Mr. Speaker, Dead North is just one example of how the N.W.T. arts industry is growing and succeeding. Over the last 10 years, the Yellowknife International Film Festival, sponsored by Western Arctic Moving Pictures, has also grown by leaps and bounds. WOMP's annual 48-hour music video competition also draws a large turnout every year. These reveal something great going on, Mr. Speaker. The Northern arts community told us for years they were ready to grow and expand into new things. This government has listened by expanding our support for the arts. Soon our new arts strategy will be released, providing further support for filmmakers, visual artists, carvers, writers, craftspeople, musicians, who all make up essential parts of our growing arts community. Mr. Speaker, our mandate goal of economic diversification has not been achieved equally well in all areas, but in the arts and film and TV in particular, I think we can all be proud of its successes. In particular, I want to congratulate the founders of Dead North and all the filmmakers, actors, technicians, and volunteers who work hard to make it possible. Thank you, and we'll see you at the movies, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ikigodan and then Member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the latest round of UNW negotiations sparked a lot of conversations about the cost of living, and not just among unionized employees, but also among those in the private sector, where step increases and annual increases aren't necessarily the norm. Businesses across the North are struggling, and with increases in the minimum wage, ever-increasing WSEC premiums, and the upcoming carbon tax hitting small businesses harder than anyone else, it's increasingly difficult for companies to just keep people employed, let alone increase wages to keep up with the cost of living. I've heard these concerns from industries across the board. Addressing the rising cost of living for unionized employees is easy. You just plug some numbers into a collective agreement. It's considerably more difficult to address in terms of the private sector, but there are some obvious things that this government can do. We can do a better job of ensuring that the money that the government spends stays in the N.W.T. With a downturn in Alberta's economy, southern companies are looking for work, and because of their lower overhead, they're often able to underbid local companies. While saving $100,000 on a $10 million contract sounds great, that's $10 million not going into the pockets of Northerners. We also need to get our WSEC premiums in check. On average, employers in the N.W.T. pay double what they would in Alberta, and our private sector employers are paying rates that are 2 to 6 times higher than the GNWT's rates. We need to do a better job utilizing the Business Development and Investment Corporation so that it lives up to its mandate and provides support to new businesses as they're developing and assists existing businesses through these tough economic times. All of these things can be done and would actually take relatively little effort. However, Mr. Speaker, there's something that could be done with virtually no effort and would have an immediate and noticeable effect for small businesses. We can reduce taxes on small businesses. Most small businesses in the North qualify for the federal small business deduction, meaning they pay a 4% corporate tax rate. I propose that we reduce that rate to 0%. That would put about $2.5 million in the pockets of private sector employers and employees and help them cope with the ever-rising cost of living. Mr. Speaker, reducing taxes is in the mandate of the GNWT, but there appears to be no effort to fulfill this commitment. So, before the end of this Assembly, I will table a private member's bill to reduce the tax rate for small businesses to 0%. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure today, as always, to recognize a man of many hats and resident of Yellowknife North, Mr. Tony Whitford. I would also like to take this opportunity to recognize Jay Balcart and Pablo Saravanja, the founders of Dead North Film Festival and the owners of Artless Collective. And we also have some friends of Dead North here with us as well, Tim Jones, and of course we have Mandy McDonald here as well. Thank you and welcome for being here, or thank you for being here. Welcome.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, I'd like to recognize some of my friends from the Canadian Parents for French organization. We have Maggie Hawks, board member, Jessica Payard, the executive director, and Wendy Karstad, who has been president of the organization for the last 6 years and is retiring this year. But the success of the organization couldn't have been done without her, and I want to recognize her time with the organization and thank them for being here today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize Ruth Carroll, originally from Fort McPherson, who's living in Whitehorse at the moment, who is our interpreter for the Gwich'in language. I'd like to thank you for all the work you've done this week, and safe travels back home. Thank you.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to recognize a couple of pages who are residents of Frame Lake, Monica Kunderlich and Grady Stable. They've been working with us throughout this long sitting and really appreciate their efforts. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. If we're missing anyone in the gallery, thanks for being here with us. It's always great to have an audience as part of our proceedings. Massey. Oh, sorry. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Yellowknife South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize a couple of pages from Yellowknife South, Janica Leah Silverio and Tyson Lafon. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Acknowledgments. Acknowledgments. Or questions. Member for Nanakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier, my member statement was on World Waters Day with the United Nations, and I have questions for the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources. Mr. Speaker, I'm aware that ENR will be running a few activities in Tuktoyaktuk for World Water Day. I'm just, for the general public, can the Minister tell us a bit more about how ENR recognizes World Water Day or other engagement activities for water awareness? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, International Water Day, as the member pointed out, is held usually on March 22nd, and it aims to highlight the importance of fresh water and the sustainable management of freshwater resources, and we recognize the importance of that. Earlier this year, the chair of the Inuvialuit Water Board reached out to our office to requesting support for an event plan for the community of Tuktoyaktuk to celebrate this year's World Water Day. In October of last year, I provided a letter of support and committed department officials to work with the board in a collaborative manner on this important event. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, Nakita Kasi, member Nanakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the response. And Mr. Speaker, organizations like the Inuvialuit Water Board have an important role to play in sustainable water management in the Northwest Territories. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is, what's the working relationship between the Department and the water boards across the Northwest Territories? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, we have long-standing relationships with the Inuvialuit Water Board as well as with the other water boards across Northwest Territories. It's extremely important that we work closely with them to advance issues. They work cooperatively on a number of public outreach activities such as regulatory guidance, training, and education. At this year's World Water Day in Tuktoyaktuk, and our staff will actually be going into Mungalandic School with staff from the board and Department of Fisheries and Oceans to provide education outreach to students grades 1 through 6. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, Tada Kasi, member Nanakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Appreciate the response. Getting back to water boards, environmental boards, they carry a lot of Indigenous knowledge and are very key in the role that they play in decisions on major projects across the territory, Mr. Speaker, and I acknowledge that and I respect that, and kudos to ENR for involving them in the decisions moving forward. Mr. Speaker, ENR is to lead the way in some very important water management work, including transboundary water agreements. Mr. Speaker, can the minister tell us how Indigenous governments and traditional knowledge are incorporated into this work? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the N.W.T has signed 3 transboundary water agreements with its neighboring jurisdictions. In 2002, we signed one with the government of the Yukon. 2015, N.W.T signed transboundary agreements with Alberta and British Columbia. And under these agreements, traditional and local knowledge is a cross-cutting theme. Traditional and local knowledge is important for setting and assessing transboundary objectives, informing all aspects of learning plan, informing long-term monitoring, and informing decision-making under these important agreements. Mr. Speaker, also in 2015, the N.W.T signed an intergovernmental agreement which outlines the role of Indigenous governments in implementation of our transboundary agreements, including Indigenous representation on established bilateral management committees. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, the member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, follow up to my member statement. I have a few questions for the Minister of Health and Social Service. I'd like to ask the Minister, how did this outbreak of measles happen? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the case involves an individual who traveled from an international destination to Inuvik by airplane. The journey returning to Inuvik took them through Yellowknife, Norman Wells on February 13th. Prior to contacting, the department has actually begun that and has started to reach out to everybody that has been contacted as part of our normal protocol when there is an infectious outbreak. So we've been working to follow up with everybody that was identified as a possible contact. The Chief Public Health Officer issued a public health advisory on February 22nd regarding the one laboratory-confirmed case of active measles in the Northwest Territories. Second advisory was issued on February 24th to provide some additional information to residents across the Northwest Territories so they understand where possible contact locations may have been and what actions they can take to protect themselves and their families. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, right now, how many cases of confirmed cases of measles are there in the Northwest Territories? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the last update I had, and I believe it's still current, was on February 21st, and at that time, 24th, and at that time, there was one laboratory-confirmed case of measles in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what can unvaccinated people do if they suspect they have been exposed to the measles virus? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, obviously we'd encourage everybody who isn't vaccinated to get vaccinated. I know that for children under 12, they can't be vaccinated. Under 12 months, they can't be vaccinated until they reach a year. So if somebody feels like they've come into contact or they feel like they're having symptoms, or if unprotected people actually develop the symptoms, they should remain in their homes and call their health center immediately. Calling the health center in advance ensures that the health centers can take the precautions necessary to prevent additional transmissions or additional contacts, reduce the number of people who may be affected. Higher risk individuals that are exposed to measles should immediately contact their health centers and healthcare practitioners to figure out how best to engage the system and make sure they get the supports and care they need. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister answered a part of this next question, but I'll ask it. What can people do to protect themselves from the measles virus? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Frankly, the best way to protect against measles disease is to get immunized. Children 12 months of age and over, and adults born before 1970 onwards, born after 1970 and onwards, should have 2 doses of the vaccine. Immunization is available in all communities, all community health centers or local public health units. Measles can be dangerous for infants, and I think we really need to be concerned for those that are unvaccinated under 12 months. Pregnant women are also at risk. Those with weakened immune systems are at greater levels of risk. For these higher risk individuals, a different form of immunization reduces the risk if given within 6 days of actual contact with somebody who has a laboratory confirmed case. So there are other options. Measles-containing vaccine is available to all N.W.T. residents. It's free. And it can be obtained at local health centers, public health units, and other places. So please get yourself immunized. If you have symptoms, contact your health practitioners right away. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Ikeda County, the member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a number of people have reached out to me recently and asked me to ask what was happening in regards to the Department of Health and Social Services commitment to traditional names being allowed on N.W.T. health birth certificates and other forms of GNWT identification. Can the minister advise us where the status of this commitment is? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on November 4th, 2016, this Legislative Assembly passed Bill 5, which was a bill to amend sections of the Vital Statistics Act that would allow us to use traditional fonts on legal documents such as birth certificates and other vital statistics documents. This is a commitment we made. This is a commitment we intend to and will live up to. Our ultimate goal is to be able to have traditional names on our birth certificates, on our vital statistics documents using the traditional font, which is truly the only way to recognize a traditional name. At that time, I said it's going to take a while for this to happen because there's multiple things that need to happen. One of the first things that we need to do is to develop a transliteration guide which will allow us to work with other jurisdictions like the federal government so that we can use our traditional font and our traditional names and have them used on things like not birth certificates, my apologies, but passports. Documents and other things outside of our jurisdiction, outside of our responsibility. Mr. Speaker, one of the biggest challenges of doing this work, and it's the right thing and we need to do it, is not producing documents with Aboriginal or traditional fonts, but it's actually the systems that we use. Things like EMR, things like PeopleSoft, things like student financial assistance systems, our database systems that actually track information and allow people to get registered for health procedures and education, these types of things. Every one of those systems will need to be updated to recognize the traditional fonts in the Northwest Territories. Health and Social Services alone has over 40 systems that will have to be upgraded to recognize traditional fonts. And across the government, over 400 systems will need to be updated to recognize traditional fonts. This is an incredibly expensive undertaking. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be done, because personally I believe it should be done, but we need to make sure that we do it right and we get it right. We are making progress. The transliteration guide is under development. ECE has taken the lead on that. They have pulled together language experts to help them with that work. They're hoping to have the draft transliteration guide done in 2019, at which point we can present it to the federal government, and then we'll begin the negotiations about trying to make sure that they can accept it and use it so that we can pursue other documents. So it's still under works. We're still making progress. It is going to take a bit of time to realize this important commitment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Akida, Council Member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that detailed answer, and that's greatly appreciated. One of the things he talked about was some acronyms of EMR. Can the Minister explain what EMR is? Because I didn't understand what that acronym means. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was just using that as just one of the examples of the systems that's used in the government of the Northwest Territories. EMRs are electronic medical records. So right now, EMR and every other system we have only recognizes the Latin alphabet. So if an individual were to be using their name and using the traditional fonts, which is where we want to get to, those systems would not recognize those names, and that's a problem. It means we could inadvertently adversely affect somebody's care or their ability to go outside of this territory to receive care. This is something we don't want to happen. We want to make sure our residents have the supports they need and they can receive their services. So we need to work in the transliteration guide. We're also going to have to update many of our systems over time so that they can recognize the traditional fonts, which, like I said, we know is the right thing to do. We're committed to it. It's going to take a bit of time to get this work done. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. Tada Daya Council Member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister talked about a lot of work being done and that. So does the Minister and the Department have a timeline when things are going to be completed? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, we have timelines on when we will complete the portions that we're working on at this point, but to roll out on the bigger level to make sure that people can get, passports and other things using their traditional names with the traditional fonts, I can't dictate that timeline. We will have the transliteration guide drafted with our partners and Education and Cultural Employment in 2019. We're thinking mid-year. And from there, we'll be able to present to the federal government. That could take some time to actually bring that to reality and make it reality. In the meantime, we will continue to figure out what capacity our systems have in this territories to recognize the traditional fonts so that we can, continue to move forward. I can't tell you how long it'll take to work that process through the federal government and other partners. I mean, we need to be careful to make sure that, once again, we're not adversely affecting our residents. I mean, by way of example, when I travel, I always hear the people at the front of the counter saying, your passport or your documents must exactly match the ticket. And if your document uses traditional fonts, but the airline has no ability to use traditional fonts, you're not getting on that plane. We want to make sure that that doesn't happen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. Nundere Council Member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the Minister elaborating and giving us the information here today. So in the meantime, so people have been asking, in the meantime, can the department, are they able to look at having birth certificates display both names, whether it be in traditional names in brackets or underneath the bottom there somewhere, so that they can actually recognize the name, the family's, the person's name in there? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have directed the department to do some additional work in this area to see if that is a possibility. It was a question I asked when I brought forward the legislation the first time, recognizing that it is going to take a bit of time to operationalize and make this official. At that time, the concern was having a legal document that had two names on it could be problematic, especially when it came to out of jurisdiction or working with the feds on things like passports. I've asked the department to explore that and seek a second opinion on that, because in my mind, it's not two names. It's one name. It's one name that is using the traditional font, which is a true representation of the child's name or the person's name, and a Latin interpretation of it. It's not a different name. It's a font issue. So I've asked for a second opinion on whether or not we can put the name twice, the same name twice, using two different fonts on a document. That's not a solution, Mr. Speaker. That I feel that that's a step to get us to where we need to be. Ultimately, we just want to be able to have the one name using the one font. But given that it's going to take time, I've asked them to explore the possibility of having the name on there twice in two different fonts. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. Ikeda County, the member Tunde Wallade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have more questions to follow up on the honourable member from Mackenzie Delta and on the measles situation. I'd like to ask the minister, how does an individual know, aside from the 1970 thing, how would an individual know if they have been vaccinated or not? Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, an individual's health records will identify when they were vaccinated, whether they actually received the 2 doses of vaccination. We strongly encourage anybody who doesn't know to get in touch with their healthcare system or the public health team, who will be able to verify your current status with respect to immunizations, for any immunizations, not just for the measles vaccine. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Council Member Trinity Williday.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, sorry, pardon me. Mr. Speaker, what is the difference? What happened in 1970 that changed? Did they eradicate measles in 1970 and stop vaccinating people? I ask for an explanation from the Minister on that, please. Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 1970, the vaccine was developed and started to be administered to citizens across this country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Council Member Trinity Williday.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Then is the Minister telling me that prior to 1970 there was no vaccination, so people born prior to 1970 were not vaccinated? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Unless somebody chose to pursue a vaccination afterwards, the answer is yeah, you weren't vaccinated prior to 1970 because the vaccine wasn't really there. One of the challenges we had is measles is highly contagious, like crazy, super contagious. It spreads very easily. The other challenge is prior to the vaccine being available, the fatality rate on measles was about 1 in 1,000 individuals who contracted the disease. When you say 1 in 1,000, it doesn't sound that high, but statistically that is a huge number of individuals dying as a result of measles. Since the vaccine has come in, measles in this country was all but eliminated, except for a few isolated incidents. Now that there's a movement by many people to not get vaccinated, we're seeing these things come back. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Council Member Trinity Williday.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister if there would be any harm in being vaccinated if you've already been vaccinated and are not aware of it. Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't actually know the answer to that. I'm happy to follow up with some medical professionals who would certainly be able to answer that question in an appropriate way. I'd hate to speculate one way or the other and give false information. I'll get that information for the member.
Merci. Oral question, the member Frame Lake.
See, Monsieur le Président. In my member statement, I outlined the great post-devolution resource giveaway through the issuance of 10 significant discovery licenses by our government. Our government will get no revenues, generate no taxes, ensure no employment, no benefits from these areas that are now tied up virtually forever. Can the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment explain what options he had available when applications for post-devolution significant discovery licenses were received in his office? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When a significant discovery declaration is applied for by the proponent, we as a government through the Office of the Regulator of the Oil and Gas Operations is required to review and identify the proponent's discovery identified and a declaration qualified as a significant petroleum find. So once they do that and it's deemed that, it has to come to my office. And as the Minister of ITI under the Petroleum Resources Act, I'm obliged to issue a SDL, which is a significant discovery license. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Or Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Council Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. And thanks to the Minister for that response. I take it then that he had really no options. So prior to devolution, the federal government issued exploration rights in the Northwest Territories, including exploration licenses. So in converting these exploration licenses to significant discovery licenses after devolution, were there any provisions available to the Minister to charge annual fees? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that the original exploration rights were issued by the federal government at that time, we had not yet begun our policy work on these types of things on the Petroleum Resource Strategy, the PRA, and the Oil and Gas Operations Act. So the answer is no. It's been the policy of our government to hold companies doing business here with the terms they negotiated with the federal government, and future SDL rates were not stated in the terms and conditions of the original call for bid documents issued by Canada prior to devolution. The government of Northwest Territories would have been put at high risk for litigation and also communicated a message of uncertainty to industry if we had changed the rules without a transparent and open process. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tadadea, Council Member Frame Lake.
Monsieur le Président, thanks to the Minister for that, and I will pursue it with him a little later offline. It's my understanding that one of the ways to generate some benefits and revenues from significant discovery licenses is to include terms and conditions in the original call for nominations and/or call for bids. Has the Minister considered this option, and are there any administrative policies or directives in place to allow for the imposition of annual fees for significant discovery licenses that may be issued in the future? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now that we've put some advanced work into our policy and our direction of how we want to do this, we now have a fuller, more robust strategic framework on doing this, which we will consider petroleum charging rental rates on future SDLs in the Northwest Territories. So these things will be specified under the terms and conditions for future bids in the Northwest Territories when we do put out these documents for bids, and our administration policies allow us to do this going forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere, Council Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that new information, and I would really urge that he share that with the public and potential interests that are looking for oil and gas up here, because I'm not aware of it ever being made public. So, Mr. Speaker, there are now 91 significant discovery licenses that cover about 4,650 square kilometers, or 82% of the size of Prince Edward Island here in the on the onshore in the Northwest Territories. Another option open to the Minister is to issue a drilling order whereby rights holders would have to conduct a drilling operation under the terms and conditions set by the Minister. Can the Minister tell us when he intends to issue drilling orders for any of the significant discovery licenses to ensure that people of the Northwest Territories accrue some benefits from these resources that are now tied up forever? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have no current plan to issue a drilling order on any SDLs in the Northwest Territories. It costs tens of millions of dollars to drill a well in the Northwest Territories, as many members in this House know. There's no compelling reason to do it at this point. There's no way to even get this stuff to market. So there's certain challenges around that, and we want to maintain a good relationship with industry and moving forward, and we want to be able to keep that leverage when we need it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, County, the member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm overjoyed to have a renewed call from this side of the House to lower small business taxes. This is an issue I've raised, holding the government accountable to its mandate commitment to do exactly that each and every sitting. I'd like to ask the Minister of Finance today, I didn't notice a decrease to small business taxes in the budget. When does he intend to fulfill that mandate commitment? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Finance.
I knew that was coming, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at the moment, we're not planning on decreasing the small business tax. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question, Akita, Council Member Cam Lake.
Mr. Speaker, why is there no plan? The mandate clearly says this government will reduce taxes on small businesses. Why? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Finance.
Speaker, and Mr. Speaker, the mandate also has 234 other items beside this one particular one. We have made progress on a number of those items, and we will continue to do so. However, this is not one of the ones that we've treated as a priority at the moment, and I've said before, and I said in the House again, that our plan is to not decrease the corporate tax. Thank you.
Oral question, Tadadea, Council Member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister knows, as do all members of this House, that the mandate is a shared responsibility on both sides of the House. The Minister has an obligation to listen to this side of the House. Will he reconsider the political position he's taken and make this a priority? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've been a member of this Legislative Assembly for 14 years, and I think that's because I've demonstrated an ability to listen to people, take people's advice, and bring their issues forward. The mandate item, we have 235 items on the mandate. a little too big in my opinion, and I think part of the advice we should provide to the next assembly coming in is to lower the number of mandate items and get to one that's workable. We've done that in the past. It's been successful. It doesn't mean we're not doing our job in fulfilling a lot of the mandate commitments. We continue to work on them as the everyday business of the government in Northwest Territories. And this is one of those items that, although it was in brochures and it will continue to be in pamphlet brochures come October 1st, it's not one that we're looking at lowering right now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Member Kamlake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, perhaps the mandate, it's not that the mandate's too big, it's that the minister doesn't have the time to dedicate to all of the commitments under his responsibility, and maybe he should get some help. And I'm willing to help him. Other members on this side are willing to help him. We can put forward this legislation. What other, if this commitment is needed, the minister said before that we provide plenty of support, what new support is coming to small businesses in the Northwest Territories? Thank you.
Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think one of the reasons I've lasted so long as a member of this Legislative Assembly is my ability to work with all members of this legislative thing. I think that's clearly demonstrated. And I do listen to the advice of members, and there's times where somebody actually has to make a decision. And we've made a decision that we're not looking at lowering the corporate tax at this particular time. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question. County, the member Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my statement today was about responding to family violence, but my questions are for the Minister of Justice about preventing it. In her most recent report, the Chief Coroner recommended that there be long-term sustained public awareness program on family and domestic violence available in all communities. I'd like to ask the Minister what action has been taken on the Coroner's recommendation. Merci.
Merci. Minister of Justice.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have looked at the coroner's report from several years ago, and certainly noticed that there were recommendations with respect to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. As members will know, the RCMP entered into agreements with local communities, and I haven't reviewed those of late, but I would expect that concerns about domestic violence, I know that those are important concerns, and it certainly is a concern of this government as we move ahead. So that is certainly in our minds, and I know that it is a priority for the RCMP, all kinds of violence, of course, the reduction of violence, and that is also a priority for this Assembly. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question. Nakita Cassie, member Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just to clarify, the coroner's report I'm speaking about is the most recent one, dated 2017, and these recommendations come from investigations into 2 domestic homicides that happened in the reporting period. The coroner's report stresses that public education is needed to raise awareness about the signs of abuse in communities so that people who are close to those at risk or who are abusive can intervene. And so my question again is what action has been taken on this recommendation? Merci.
Merci. Minister of Justice.
Yes, thank you. And as I mentioned earlier, I have looked at, in fact, have in front of me the coroner's report from 2017. It is a priority, of course, addressing this issue of family violence is a priority of the 18th Assembly, and we are developing a comprehensive approach to addressing family violence. The goal is to identify best practices, align existing N.W.T work, and identify priority areas for investment over the coming decade. We've contracted Aurora Research Institute to identify best practices to prevent and reduce family violence, and they will finish their work early in the 2019-2020 fiscal year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tadade Cassie, member Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the Minister for that answer. There were some things there that I had not heard before. And so when can we expect then a more concerted effort to take those findings and make them into a more comprehensive public awareness campaign? Thank you.
Minister of Justice.
As I mentioned previously, we've contracted Aurora Research to identify best practices, and that's the first phase of this work. The second phase will be a strategic stakeholder consultation on the results of the research to have meaningful guidance to balance research-based evidence with frontline voices and lived experience of Northerners. So we are, as I say, we have contracted Aurora Research to assist us. That's only the first step. The second step is action. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question. Nundere Cassie, member Yellowknife Center.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Thanks again to the Minister for that. Mr. Speaker, there is no increase in the Justice budget for the next fiscal year in the line Protection Against Family Violence. So I'm wondering at what point this initiative the Minister has spoken of will be operationalized in terms of assigning spending to it. Thank you.
Minister of Justice.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned, we expect the researchers will finish their work early in the 2019-20 fiscal year, and at that point we should be able to give a better estimate as to when we can move forward to the second stage. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question. Ikeda County, the member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if you've been following the news, you may have read about a resident of Hay River, Mrs. Dawn Ludet, who late last week underwent a double lung transplant in Edmonton. She's been waiting for this for about 10 years, and by all accounts, things went well, and she's recovering, and I wish her all the best, as I'm sure all the members do. And I also want to thank the donor, for the gift of life, essentially, that they gave her. And this has raised some questions coming out of Hay River about organ donation. I know that last year there was talk about, well, I think for many years now, there's been talk about being able to donate organs and the process surrounding that and what we're going to do moving forward. So if I have some questions for the Minister of Health, and I'd like to start off with asking, what is the current process if someone wants to become an organ donor in the Northwest Territories? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, residents of the Northwest Territories, they can donate their organs and tissues as long as they're in a hospital with access to transplant services at the time of death. Due to clinical capacity, that doesn't exist in the Northwest Territories, so all organs and tissues that want to be donated by N.W.T. residents has to be done in a different location. Often for us, that is Alberta. We did pass legislation in 2014, which still hasn't gone live yet. Regardless of that legislation passing, N.W.T. residents still can donate, but usually it's a long process, and it requires an N.W.T. or an Alberta clinician believing that a patient, first off, is an appropriate donor, and then they would have to seek consent and support from family members. And then that person, if they're in the Northwest Territories, would have to be transported south to have those organs and or tissues donated. So it's a bit of a roundabout way, and it requires family consent. You can't, until that legislation we pass goes live, you can't actually pre-identify somebody who wants to be a donor in the Northwest Territories.
Merci. Oral question. Akita Cassie, member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for that explanation. I'm sure there's a lot going on at that time when someone is being considered as an organ donor. It means they're close to passing away or they passed away, and so it's not a time you want to have to make these kind of decisions. So my understanding is the registry would allow people to register as an organ donor prior to passing away, even when they're in good health. So I'm glad to hear that the work is going on, but I'd like to know what is the status of this work and when can we expect it to go live? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
So, Mr. Speaker, this is a file that has been important to me for a large number of years, and unfortunately it has taken way longer to make progress on it than I or anybody had hoped. We had hoped actually to be live early in the life of this government, but there had been a change in the government in Alberta, and they're a key partner in making this happen. Because we want to be able to have our residents register on their Alberta Organ and Tissue Donation Registry. I'm happy to say that we have made significant progress. Negotiations have basically been concluded. We're now basically dotting some I's and crossing some T's on an agreement, and it's my understanding that we are going to be able to go live with our component, our ability to have N.W.T. residents register this summer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tadadea, Council Member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's great news. I know it's been a long time coming, so I'm happy to hear that. To make this program successful, I think there needs to be a public education campaign. So can the minister detail whether or not there is such a campaign in the works and maybe give us some information about it? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. The member is absolutely correct. I mean, we could do this and it could be available, but if people don't know about it, they're not going to register. We are planning a significant public launch where we'll have an opportunity to explain process, get information out. I'll certainly be working with MLAs, hoping that they can help share the information with their constituents, but we are in the process of developing a comprehensive communications plan to get this information out, and I look forward to working with the members to get that information out. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral questions. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I was asking questions for the Minister of Health and Social Services in regards to speech and language pathologists and OT positions and the issues around that. And I'd like to follow up on some questions here today. So, Mr. Speaker, can the Minister please explain how we are going to be able to provide the necessary assessments for children from the smaller community, especially if there are challenges to see them in person? And yesterday the Minister said there may be opportunity for the positions to go into the communities, but I just want to clarify that with the Speaker here, or the Minister here today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you. Two parts to that question. The first part is the second part. My first answer is based on the second part. Yesterday, when I was talking about going into the community, as I was talking about OT and speech language professionals, they don't currently travel to some of the smaller communities in the DHO. I've provided direction to the department that I'd like to see more engagement in smaller communities. It still depends on caseload. If there's only one person, it may not be appropriate or financially reasonable to do that, but if there's a larger caseload, we want our professionals to go into the communities. With respect to the first part of the question, we are working on an improvement project in the DHO region, and it includes a number of things, using electronic medical records to track and improve DHO region performance on screening and referring children to need rehab services. The improvement project is basically tracking a number of things, the number of children by community who should be assessed, the number of children who received the well child assessment, which is an important part of the assessment process, and the number of children requiring assessment or referral to speech language pathology and occupational therapy, but also a referral to a pediatrician through the well child assessment process. The goal that we're working to was to identify the need earlier and ensure that there is earlier referral to these services. And we are screening more children as a result of what we've already started, as more children are attending the well child clinics in the DHO communities. And we believe and feel comfortable that this is going to lead to more referrals for rehab services, which the team in Yellowknife is going to be able to provide once we actually create those positions and hire those people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nakirade, Council Member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've heard that in the DHO region they have a team that has been engaged in improving initiatives over the past year to improve rates of early child development screening of children to improve their early detection and earlier referral to rehabilitation services, which the Minister talked about. Can the Minister explain what some of the new improvements that I've heard about that he can share with us here today? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in my previous answer, I actually talked about some of the work that we're doing in this exact area to increase the number of referrals. In addition to that, in this current fiscal year, the one we're in and is about to end, we did create some new rehab therapy type positions in the Beaufort Delta. Those services used to be provided by Yellowknife with the existing teams, and meant that there was about 5 or so clinical days, travel days up in the Beaufort Delta. Those travel days are now going to be reallocated to the southern portion of this territory, which means the number of days available to Fort Smith, Hay River, and the DHO are up. In addition, with the new team we're creating as a result of this budget that is before us today, should it be approved, we are creating more positions in Yellowknife with a focus on providing services to youth across the territory, primary focus on the southern part of the territories, as we have the team up in the Beaufort Delta. That will also increase the number of days and supports available to all residents, including residents who live in the smaller communities and south of Great Slave Lake. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tadade, Cassie, member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the minister explain how does the system help teachers support students who have rehabilitation needs in the system right now? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, during regularly scheduled trips to communities, the OT and speech-language pathologists spend time in the schools. They actually go into the schools, observing classrooms, assessing and providing treatment to children, meeting with different educators. This includes teachers, Mr. Speaker, program support teachers, education assistants, and inclusive schooling coordinators to provide suggested global and specific strategies on interventions, things that they can do to help support development in these areas. Mr. Speaker, additionally, services are provided remotely through video conferencing, telespeech, with students and education assistants. I know Education, Culture and Employment also supports educators in this area and is in the early stages of establishing a territorial-based support team of specialized consultants who will be available to support school staff and parents in implementing supports for their children. So it's about working together. This team is being incrementally built over the next 2 years, starting in 1920, but really, if you want details on that, I would suggest talking to the Minister of Education and Culture and Employment. I will say that this team will support the work of health professionals who are already working within the schools and provide complementary support such as planning, implementation, resource development. So, Mr. Speaker, bottom line is we don't feel we can do this without the support of the schools and the teachers. We're working together. As we continue to roll this out, there will likely be growing pains. We will work together to overcome these growing pains to make sure that we are providing the supports to those kids who need it when they need it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundere Cassie, member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again, thank the Minister for all these answers and clarifications on some of these things. So if I'm looking to get more information from the DHO and the N.W.T authorities to help me better understand what programs and services and supports are available for the region and Staten for children requiring rehab services, can the Minister please advise what positions and whom I should be able to talk to so I can get better informed in this area? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, kind of two different answers here. If the member is looking for information for himself, we do have protocols that have been established as far as how MLAs engage with departments. I'd be happy to set up meetings or appointments between the member and local staff like the COO in the DHO. I would also suggest that possibly meeting with the territorial manager of Allied Health Services here in Yellowknife, who is with the N.W.T. HSSA, might be valuable for the member to help educate him. And I'm happy to arrange those following our protocols. If he's asking the question as a citizen, as somebody who lives in the riding, my recommendation would be talk to the professionals, talk to the CEO, talk to individuals in the health and social services system that are located in the community. They will be able to provide residents with the information they need and or how to seek a referral. And if you have a child 0 to 5, I strongly encourage you to attend the Well Baby Clinics as regular as needed to ensure that your children are meeting their important milestones, and if they're not, are getting referrals as quickly as possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral questions. Member for, no, oral questions. Oral questions. Written questions. Member for Nahende.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to seek unanimous consent to return to item number 5, recognition of visitors in the gallery. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member seeking unanimous consent to return to item number 5 on orders of the day, recognition of visitors in the gallery. Are there any nays? There are no nays. Member Nahende, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I'd like to recognize Norma Jumbo, who is a chaperone for their 2 pages, Aiden and Adam, and I'd like to thank her for all her commitment and work to bring these young men here to learn our operation here, and thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports of Committee on the Review of Bills. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to report to the Assembly that the Standing Committee on Government Operations has reviewed Bill 26, Statistics Act, and that Bill 26 is now ready for consideration in Committee of the Whole as amended and reprinted. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Reports of Committee on the Review of Bills. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, your committee would like to report on its consideration of Bill 30, an act to amend the Human Rights Act. Bill 30 received second reading in the Legislative Assembly on October 31st, 2018, and was referred to the Standing Committee on Government Operations for review. To permit time for the legislative drafters to complete the proposed amendments, I would like to advise the House of the committee's wish to extend our review of the bill with the intention of reporting back to the House on or before March 11th, 2019. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, in accordance with Rule 75(1)(c) of the Rules of the Legislative Assembly of the Northwest Territories, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Hay River North, that the review period for Bill 30 be extended to March 11th, 2019. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Motions in order. Motions non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Masi. Reports of Committee on Review of Bills. Reports of Committee on Review of Bills. Tabling of documents. Minister responsible for Northwest Territories Power Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following document entitled Annual Report 2017-2018 N.W.T. Hydro Corporation and N.W.T. Power Corporation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Tabling of documents. Member for Trinidad-Willowday.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table information package on Thaidananana, land of our ancestors. It's okay, Denny.
Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Colleagues, pursuant to Section 5 of the Indemnities, Allowances, and Expense Regulations of Legislative Assembly and Executive Council Act, I wish to table the summary of members' absences for the period October 11th, 2018 to February 4th, 2019. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading bills. Notices of motion for first reading bills. Motion. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Great Slave, that notwithstanding Rule 4, when this House adjourns on February the 28th, 2019, it shall be adjourned until Tuesday, March the 5th, 2019. And further, that at any time prior to March the 5th, 2019, if the Speaker is satisfied after consultation with the Executive Council and members of the Legislative Assembly that the public interest requires that the House should meet at an earlier time during the adjournment, the Speaker may give notice, and thereupon the House shall meet at the time stated in such notice and shall transact its business as it has been duly adjourned to that time. Merci.
Motion's in order. To the motion. Question's been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Masi. Motions. Motions. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Nunavik Twin Lakes, that Bill 40, Smoking Control and Reduction Act, be read for the second time. This bill repeals the Cannabis Smoking Control Act and replaces it with a new act. It also replaces provisions of the Tobacco Control Act. This bill creates prohibitions and offenses, including in respect of smoking in public place and in motor vehicle while another person who is a minor is present in the motor vehicle. Imposes requirements in respect of the display of signs, including signs respecting the health risks associated with smoking. Provides for enforcement of the bill and any regulations made under it. Authorizes the making of regulations and consequently amends the Cannabis Products Act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Motions in order. To the principle of the bill. Questions been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 40 has had a second reading. Is now referred to a standing committee. Second reading of bills. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the honourable member for Inuvik Twin Lakes, that Bill 41, the Tobacco and Vapor Products Control Act, be read for the second time. This bill repeals the Tobacco Control Act and replaces it with a new act. This bill creates prohibitions and offences, including in respect of the sale, supply, and display of tobacco products, vapor products, accessories, and prescribed substances or products. Imposes requirements in respect of the display of signs respecting the legal age to purchase such as products, accessories, or substances. Imposes an automatic prohibition in respect of the sale or storage of such products, accessories, or substances in a place in which at least 2 sales offenses have been committed within a 5-year period, and imposes requirements in respect of the display of signs respecting the automatic prohibition in the place. Provides for the enforcement of the bill and any regulations made under it, authorizes the making of regulations, and consequently amends the Tobacco Tax Act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. The motions in order to the principle of the bill. Questions been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 41 has had a second reading. Is now referred to a standing committee. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration Committee of the Whole Bills and Other Matters. Bill 31, Committee Report 12-18-3, Committee Report 13-18-3, Minister Statement 131-18-3, Minister Statement 151-18-3, Minister Statement 158-18-3, and Table Document 322-18-3 with Member Hay River North in the chair.
I'll now call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Committee would like to consider main estimate or table document 322-18(3 main estimates 2018 to 2020 with the Department of Executive and Indigenous Affairs as the item under consideration for Committee of the Whole today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. We will consider the document after a brief recess. Welcome back, committee. Committee, we have agreed to consider main estimates, the Department of Executive and Indigenous Affairs. I will turn to the minister responsible for opening comments, Premier McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to present the 2019-20 main estimates for the Department of Executive and Indigenous Affairs. These estimates total $22.1 million, which represents an overall proposed increase of $715,000 or 3% over the 2018-19 main estimates. The department's proposed increase relates to force growth, initiatives, and transfers partly offset by sunsets. Highlights of the proposed estimates include $250,000 in funding to assist in self-government implementation, $50,000 in additional funding to match contributions to the Arctic Inspiration Prize, and $38,000 in additional funding to support the delivery of campaign schools to further encourage women's participation in politics. These estimates continue to support the priorities of the 18th Legislative Assembly by improving residents of smaller communities' awareness and ability to access government programs and services through government service officers and single-window service centres. Currently, there are 22 communities across the Northwest Territories with single-window service centres, providing residents with a single point of access to information on government programs and services. Of these 22 single-window service centres, 15 have now expanded their services to seamlessly deliver Government of Canada programs and services directly to residents in some of our most remote communities. These estimates also include $250,000 in additional resources for the continuation of advancing, finalizing, and implementing lands, resources, and self-government agreements, with the possibility of up to 42 self-government financing agreements and implementation plans in the Northwest Territories. This funding supports the Government of Northwest Territories' mandate and legal commitments and obligations arising from self-government agreements. The additional funding for the Arctic Inspiration Prize shows the Government of Northwest Territories' continued commitment to a strong and sustainable Arctic in the areas of education, human health, socio-cultural issues, environment, and economy. Finally, these main estimates continue to support initiatives designed to increase the number of women running for elected office in the Northwest Territories in support of our mandate commitments in this area. That concludes my opening remarks. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Premier. Do you have witnesses you wish to bring into the House?
Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Sergeant at Arms, please escort the witnesses into the chamber. Please introduce your witnesses for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To my left, I have Michael Omon, Secretary to Cabinet Director or Deputy Minister of Executive and Indigenous Affairs, and to my right, I have Serbahan Emilian, Director of Shared Services. Thank you.
Thank you. Committee, the department begins on page 103 of the document. There are 5 activities, and there are 3 additional information items at the end, which we will treat as one. We'll defer consideration of the total department until after consideration of the activities. The first activity is on page 110, Cabinet Support. Comments or questions from committee? Cabinet Executive and Indigenous Affairs, Cabinet Support, Operations Expenditure Summary, $2,400,000.
$523,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Moving on to activity 2, corporate communications. Begins on page 113. Comments or questions? Executive and Indigenous Affairs, Corporate Communications, Operations, Expenditure Summary, $1,399,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Please turn to the next activity, Directorate, which begins on page 116. Comments or questions? Mr. Nakamayak, getting things started.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just looking at the fourth line on page 117, I noticed that they were giving $100,000 to the Tuktoyaktuk Community Corporation Strategic Direction Action Plan. So there's that's my question is just is that sunset? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, that was for a 2-year period that will sunset this year.
Thank you, Mr. Nakamayak.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. That was just for the Nuvik to Tuktoyaktuk Highway, if I'm correct, right? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Premier.
No, that was to the community corporation to help provide for some tourism facilities and products to deal with the influx of tourists brought on by the opening of the Nuvik to Tuktoyaktuk Highway. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nakamayak.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I noticed that this fall there will be construction to the Cleacher Wall Season Road, and it seems I don't think it's the government's fault, but the planning for visitor centers and things like that to prepare a community for such infrastructure. And looking forward, hopefully there are a lot of lessons learned from the Nuvik Tuktoyaktuk Highway construction project going to the Cleacher so that they're better, more well prepared as the open infrastructure like that. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's just.
Thank you. Would the Premier care to respond? Premier?
Thank you. Yes, in this case, it was viewed as a one-off, and it was strongly suggested to us that we shouldn't be providing one-offs. So in future, our expectation is that it will be dealt with through the main project funding. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Anything further?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Nakamayak. Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask the Premier if this is the correct area to be talking about expansion of the single window service centers. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Premier?
I think it would be more properly dealt with through this section on regional operations, but if the member wants to talk about it now, that'd be fine as well.
Thank you. If it's found in regional operations, I suggest we... regional operations, where would the regional operations be found, I guess? I don't see an activity called regional operations. All right, we'll discuss it here. Mr. Bolio.
I see that okay, on the line regional operations, I guess it's where the single service. I just have a question. If there's any thought or discussion or plan to expand to data. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess the original idea for service officers was to help serve the most remote, isolated communities, and DETA is, I guess, in the wintertime, it's 5 minutes away. So I expect that at some point, if resources are available, we would look at it. DETA is only 5 minutes away from all of the government services in Yellowknife. So, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Bolio?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, yes, I remember the concept of single service windows. I agree that it's remote, but surprisingly, it appears as though there could really be a need for it in DETA. And also, it appears as though if we had a single service center in DETA, it's almost like the YK Denny would look at that to also service the people in Delo. And I thought about this a lot, and I'm thinking that even due to language, some of the elders and a lot of this service is directed to the elders. Some of the elders prefer to have deal with their get their services in their own language. As people may know, I speak one of the languages that the elders use, but not both. So I'm wondering to take a look at it, maybe for language reasons, and also for the fact that even though DETA is close, like I said, it appears as though they're still not coming into Yellowknife to get the services that Yellowknife people will gather throughout the city. I know that this is so that it could bring all the N.W.T services into a single window. So again, I'd like to ask the Premier if they would at least look at it to see if, like you said, if there's extra money in the future that they could put into this, that there would be, that DETA wouldn't be completely out of getting, if there's absolutely no possibility of them getting a single service in their community. Thank you.
Thank you. Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess in my mind, there's two ways to deal with it. Probably the easiest one would be if we had additional resources and DETA popped up as a top priority, then we would probably, that would be the best way to go. I guess a more complicated way is to look at our whole, how we provide bilingual services. We pay bilingual employees extra money to provide services in their Aboriginal languages. We have interpreters at work. Maybe it's better to just focus on communities that speak the language. But so I guess right now my preference would be to see if we can find additional resources to see if we can do something for DETA. I mean, there's some communities where we're offering GSOs and they don't want it, so maybe we could look at moving some as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Nothing further from Mr. Bolio. Next, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I think regular MLAs have been asking for 3 years. This will be the 4th year. If there's a plan to complete the single window service centers, GSOs, or similar functions for all of the communities of the Northwest Territories. Is there such a plan, and can the Minister share it with the regular MLAs? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Premier?
Yeah, thank you. We responded to committee by letter on February 11th, and that's our approach to dealing with this. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Sorry, I didn't quite hear what the Premier said. If you could provide an explanation, that would be helpful. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We provided through a confidential letter our response to his very question on the letter dated February 11th to the member. And essentially we said if we had additional resources, we would look at it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'm trying to understand what the problem is here. If there are additional resources required, why not prepare a plan so we know what those are, and whether it's over 3, 5 years, whatever, that's fine. And how that function is going to be carried out in the regional centers, the capital, to have these single window service centers. So I don't understand what the problem is in preparing a plan. Can the minister try again? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the problem is a difference in opinion. When we first started with single service centers, it was for small isolated communities, not for the capital city, not for regional centers. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I guess we actually do have a difference of opinion here. I don't understand why we wouldn't want to ensure that our residents in regional centers, including Yellowknife, would have access to single window service centers. It's a good move that there's 15 communities now where the federal government and territorial government services are offered through a one-window approach. Why wouldn't we want to do that sort of thing in regional centers as well, or even Yellowknife? Service Canada has an office here in Yellowknife. Is there not a way that we could try to work with those folks so that they could also offer information and access to N.W.T programs? I don't think it necessarily even means hiring more staff. But without a plan, it's just not going to happen. So can the minister commit to prepare a plan to roll out this function in all of our communities? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess our plan is we've been converting all of our services to online services as much as we can, and we're continuing to move in that direction. We're also moving towards single window services. We have shared services arrangements, and if the member feels that we'd be better served by having individual service center operate service officers in Yellowknife, well, we certainly can look at that as well. Thank you.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'm actually suggesting that, and I think that's what a number of regular MLAs have been suggesting for the last 3 years, the development of such a plan. It's fine to have more services available online, but not everybody has access to the internet. Not everybody knows how to use the internet. We have a growing population of seniors that I think would find that function particularly helpful. So can the minister commit to prepare such a plan? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Premier?
I guess at this late stage, if it's on the mandate list for the next government, they could look at it for sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think we'll just have to wait until we get a different minister to complete this task. But can someone tell me whether there's any plans to review the Status of Women Council Act? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Premier?
Certainly not by EIA. All we do is provide administrative services to the minister responsible for women, and I don't think there's a plan to review the Status of Women Act at this time.
The minister wants to speak.
And perhaps through you, Mr. Chair, we can pass it over to the minister responsible for Status of Women.
Thank you. Minister Cochrane?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the Act for the Status of Women actually was a priority. It was one that I had actually identified when I first began my position as Minister of Status of Women. However, at that time, working with the Status of Women Council, N.W.T. Status of Women Council, that they felt that it was appropriate, that it didn't need any changes. Since that time, there's been a total change in administration and chairs. So they have looked at it again, and they're in agreement with me that it needs to be changed. So, but because it's so late in the day, then we've agreed to put it on to the 19th Legislative Assembly. But it does definitely need to be changed. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Cochrane. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that the minister say that it's quite an antiquated piece of legislation, and I would hope that it makes it into transition reports from your side of the House and our side is something that needs to be done. So that's all I've got, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Next we have Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Going back to single window service centers, I know in the riding there's two that are, one it's sort of kind of has, one we haven't figured out if they're going to take it or not. But what is happening with the community of Wrigley? When are they on the schedule to get a GSO? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Omond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the member's referring to Samba K, and if we're still going to try and establish a single window service center there, planning on going back into the community one more time. If that doesn't work out, we're also starting to have some discussions with Wrigley, because if we can't go into Samba K, then we would probably go look to try to establish a single service center with that funding in Wrigley.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate that answer and the clarity on that. So if somebody takes it, will Wrigley be the next one on the planning doc or being looked at? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Premier?
That's correct.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So can the Premier, when we talk about Friendship Center funding, and can the Premier explain a little bit more exactly what is happening with this pot of money? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We had committed to provide $80,000 a year for 2 years with a commitment that we would match up to a further, I think it was a further $175,000 if they raise the money. I don't, it hasn't been brought to my attention, but I don't believe that they've come back and asked for additional matching money yet at this point. So I'm hopeful that they will be able to come and ask for more money very shortly. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I hope they do too. I think it's a very important organization, the Friendship Center, and I know the Premier thinks the same thing. And so after 2 years, are we looking at to review it and seeing if there's an opportunity to continue this arrangement, or is it done after these 2 years? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As we normally do, we would review how successful or not successful that pilot project was, and if we feel it'll be successful, and if the friendship centers are still all committed to it, I would hope that we could go forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next I have Mr. Blake, I believe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just under the government Windows service centers, I know we discussed it in the past, but it's a great program in the communities. I'm in my riding, communities like Sigachik with no services in the community. This is a real benefit. But one thing we were asking about was making these positions full-time. Right now they're part-time, and they have a big workload, especially at times in the fall and even this time of year, mainly because it seems like every year elders have to fill out these same forms, whether it's home heating subsidies, help with their taxes. Mr. Chair, there's a big demand for help, especially with the elderly. So will the Premier and the department look at making these full-time positions? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Premier?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess we look at it from a couple of angles. One is if the workload supports the fact that we need full-time positions, and we're prepared to look at it. And secondly, a lot of the service workers that only working half-time, that's their preference. A lot of them would prefer to stay at half-time because in some cases, if we change it, then we'll probably have to find other people that are willing to work full-time, but certainly we're prepared to look at it if the workload warrants it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Blake?
Well, it sounds promising. I'm sure the larger communities, like, for example, Fort McPherson or Aklavik would be willing to do that, as there's, a lot more people in the community, bigger demand with elders and, people that need these services. It's a great benefit to the communities, and look forward to that full-time position in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. Anything else on the department or on the activity directorate? Seeing none, I will call the page. Executive and Indigenous Affairs Directorate Operations Expenditure Summary, $5,725,000. Does committee agree? Thank you. Committee, please turn to the fourth activity, Executive Council Offices. This activity begins on page 120. Comments or questions from committee? Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So there's an increase of $200,000 in ministers' offices. Actually, if you go back to 2017-18, it's almost $400,000. So can someone help me understand these increases? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's been, over the past 3 years, there's been significant increase in ministerial travel, primarily because of the fact that the new federal government, or I guess the current federal government, operates a lot more out of Ottawa than the previous government. So our ministers have to travel a lot more to Ottawa to meet with their counterparts and to advance our federal engagement strategy and to promote the priorities of the government of the Northwest Territories. And as well, we have committed to much more increased public engagement, be it cabinet meetings and regional centers and so on. So that's the reason for the increase. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So, yeah, the minister also talked about increases in travel. So the travel budget, if you look further down on page 121, it's almost doubled back to 2017-18. It's now $420,000 even from last year. It was 170. That's a huge increase. So is this travel then related to trips to Ottawa and Cabinet having these open houses in various communities throughout the Northwest Territories? Is that what's happening here? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Premier?
That's correct, as well as government promotions in different sectors. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So, I don't know, is there any kind of a breakdown for how much is for trips to Ottawa versus travel within the N.W.T? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Premier?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, this is a cost that we've been trying to carry for the past 3 years, and every year we have exceeded the expropriation by an average of $344,000. So, and we expect this to continue, if not increase. So, hence the addition to the main estimates. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So, if there's that much over, why is there no difference then between the main and the revised estimates shown in the two middle columns, 2018-19, for travel? Thanks, Mr. Chair. Or is this, sorry, is this something that only shows up then in the public accounts? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Premier?
Yes, so generally the increase or the overages have been picked up by the departments, which in some cases could possibly impact on programs, delivery programs and services. So, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I don't have any further questions.
Thank you. Executive and Indigenous Affairs, Executive Council Offices, Operations Expenditure Summary, $4,281,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Please turn to the final activity, Indigenous and Intergovernmental Affairs. Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I realize that this is not the budget of the government of the Northwest Territories, but on the radio today, the North Slave, the N.W.T. Métis Nation was referring to their issue with getting monies, funding for negotiations, that money that usually comes from the federal government. I'm wondering if our government is involved in some way supporting the Métis to work with the federal government to try to get the money for the continued negotiations. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We certainly work closely with the N.W.T. Métis Nation, in addition to the being one of the tripartite negotiators, and we had committed to support the N.W.T. Métis Nation in their efforts to get increased funding, not only for their land claim, but also their cost of negotiations. And we have I wouldn't say given them advice, but we have talked to them about the size of negotiating teams, and obviously the Métis, N.W.T. Métis Nation will make their own decisions on what is most effective for them in their negotiations, and because we recognize that the federal government has made different promises, and one of the things that they are tightening up on is the cost of negotiations, even though they have made statements in the public that they are covering the cost of negotiations, and in some cases they'll reimburse them. But I guess a long answer to your question. We are supportive, but at the end of the day, it's a decision made by the federal government. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, could the Premier tell us if there's any such issue with the negotiations that involved Quechua? Thank you.
Thank you. Premier?
Not that we're aware of, Mr. Chair, but my understanding is money is a constant issue in negotiations, and everybody could always use more money, I'm sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Seeing nothing further, we'll call this activity. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. The minister in his opening remarks talked about how there was a $250,000 increase for finalizing and implementing lands, resources, self-government agreements. Is that the line item that's found on page 124? There seems to be a 300, or maybe, I guess it is $250,000 increase just for implementation. Is that what the minister's opening remarks refers to? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The 250,000 that was in my opening remarks, I was referring to contracted facilitators. One of the actions that I took in partnership with the federal minister of CERNA, where we hired two ministerial special representatives, and one of the recommendations was that the government should take much more of a leadership role in facilitating discussions in self-government implementation. And so that's what this money is for, so that we can try to help facilitate these discussions to advance the finalization of self-government agreements. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. That's helpful in understanding what the $250,000 is for. Can someone tell me where it's found on page 124? There's obviously some changes from the 2018-19 revised estimates to what's proposed for 2019-20. So can someone tell me where the $250,000 is found in those items? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Omand?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So that increase can be found under contract services. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So that's very helpful. That's the expenditure category. Is it also found, where is it found in the program detail? Is it in, looks like there's a large increase or largish increase in the implementation. Is that the function in which this increase is found? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Omand?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's correct.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm just wondering, what is the prospect of us actually reaching any final agreements with any of the outstanding negotiations between now and the end of the 18th Assembly? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Premier?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess on the larger ones, I think my assessment is that probably the one that we're making the most progress on is the KHO. The N.W.T. Métis Nation have they put their negotiations on hold for the next couple of months until the new fiscal year. The DICHO have determined that instead of focusing on the land and resource development side, they're going to focus on self-government. And they at Chaudhary have a new negotiating team and advisors, and they're revisiting their negotiations mandates. I think we still can expect a lot of success in self-government agreements, and up and down the valley, where the Satu community self-government negotiations are going well. The Gwich'in are back to the table with Nitagwichin and the GTC of Fort McPherson, Sigachik, and Atlavik. And I think that we will continue to make progress in those areas. And I think south, the Catlo-Decho First Nations are looking at treaty land entitlement, I believe. So that's sort of a cross-section of where we're at with all these different tables. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So just to be clear, I guess, so between the beginning of this assembly and right now, the only agreements in principle that have actually been reached are for the Norman Wells self-government. Is that correct? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Premier.
No, we settled the Delaney final agreement as well. So.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for that reminder. I had forgotten about Delaney. Yeah, I guess I'll just express some concern. I'm not sure how much progress we're going to get between now and the end of the 18th Assembly. I think the mandate commitment was that we were going to complete all the negotiations, so I'm not sure we're going to be in a position to do that, and I'm concerned about it. So thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Executive and Indigenous Affairs, Indigenous and Intergovernmental Affairs, Operations Expenditure Summary, $8,175,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. There's a few information items beginning at page 127 to 129. The committee has questions. If not, we can return to the total department found on page 107. Comments or questions? Seeing none. Executive and Indigenous Affairs, total department, $22,103,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Does committee agree this concludes our consideration of the Department of Indigenous and Executive Affairs? Thank you, committee. Thank you to the witnesses. Sergeant at Arms, you may escort the witnesses from the chamber. What's the wish of committee? Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that the chair rise and report progress. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. There's a motion to report progress. The motion is in order, non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. I will rise and report progress. Thank you, committee.
May I have the report, Member Hay River North?
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering table document 322-18(3) main estimates 2019-2020 and would like to report progress. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with.
Do I have a seconder? Member for Yellowknife North. Motion's in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Massey. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Madam Clerk, orders of the day.
Ordre du jour, le mardi 5 mars, 13h30. Prière, déclaration de ministre, déclaration de député, rapport de comité permanent et spéciaux, réponse aux questions orales, présentation de visiteurs dans la galerie, mention, questions orales, questions écrites, réponse aux questions écrites, réponse au discours d'ouverture de la commissaire, pétition, rapport de comité à la suite de l'étude du projet de loi, dépôt de documents, avis de motion tendant à la première lecture du projet de loi, motion, première lecture du projet de loi, deuxième lecture du projet de loi, étude en comité plénier des projets de loi et d'autres affaires, projet de loi numéro 31, rapport de comité 12-18-3, rapport de comité 13-18-3, déclaration du ministre 131-18-3, 151-18-3, 158-18-3, 322-18-3, document déposé 322-18-3. Rapport du comité plénier, troisième lecture du projet de loi, appel de l'ordre du jour.
Good job. Massey. This House stands adjourned till Tuesday, March 5th, 2019 at 1:30 p.m.